As the calendar turns to 2020, we are entering the final sprint to Iowa and New Hampshire. Many of the 2020 Democratic candidates spent their holiday crisscrossing the states and talking to voters. We are just 36 days away from the first in the nation Iowa caucuses and 44 days away from the New Hampshire primary. We have CBS News campaign reporters following the candidates across New Hampshire and Iowa. Nicole Sganga is in Newport, New Hampshire. Hudak is in Clarinda, Iowa. And Jack Turman is in Johnston, Iowa. Welcome to all of you. Nicole, I'd like to start with you. You asked Tulsi Gabbard about her decision to vote present on 2 articles of impeachment. Here's what she said.
I think these decisions have to be made in an unemotional way, really being clear-eyed about what the consequences are, about how partisan impeachment only further divides an already divided country. And for those of us who care a lot about beating Donald Trump, just understanding the reality that this impeachment would not remove him from office. That's a fact. Unfortunately, it would further embolden him, strengthen his support, make it more likely that he will gain in that support, making it more likely that the House will lose more Democratic seats, potentially allowing the Republicans to regain the majority.
So the move clearly differentiated her from the other Democratic candidates. How is it playing with voters, though, on the campaign trail?
Absolutely. And overall, voters here in New Hampshire are pretty supportive of her impeachment vote. They think that, like the rest of her message of unifying the country, this really sets her apart in calling out partisan politics, in calling out the Democratic Party. Representative Tulsi Gabbard told me that she's only gotten a handful of questions about impeachment so far, but I should say that I was at a campaign event with her just yesterday in Nashua, New Hampshire, and a voter who was quite upset had a back and forth exchange with her, repeatedly asking if there was incontrovertible evidence of a high crime or misdemeanor, how would you have voted and why did you vote present in that case? She's also received some backlash from back at home in Hawaii of former Governor Neil Abercrombie calling for her resignation. But again, here in New Hampshire, those who are speaking out against her present vote seem to be the minority. I spoke to about 5 voters at that event yesterday in Nashua, and 4 of them told me they were supportive of President Trump, but a little tired of his personality and looking for other options. And so certainly Representative Gabbard is also attracting independent voters here in the Granite State, even Republicans considering switching their party vote. So they don't like to hear a whole lot about impeachment.
Interesting to hear about the potential crossover there. Well, Zach, we heard former Vice President Joe Biden backtrack on his earlier position that he would not comply with the congressional subpoena to testify in President Trump's impeachment trial. What is Senator Elizabeth Warren's view on this?
Her view is essentially what former Vice President Joe Biden said he would do, that if there is a lawfully issued subpoena, he should abide by it. This, is really not a major thing. This is what he said he would do after he walked back his initial stance on this. But it's noteworthy because Warren spent so much of her campaign in 2019 completely avoiding any conflict. And this is another instance, sort of in the past couple months, where she's actually taken the opportunity to call for another candidate to do something, should something happen. Typically, she would have just deflected and said, we should focus on Donald Trump, which she did say at the start, but then continued on to say he should, in fact, abide by the subpoena if he's issued one.
Well, Warren's campaign has seen a significant slowdown in fundraising. Zach, is it affecting the campaign, and what impact could a Senate trial have?
I think that the fundraising is impacting the campaign strategy a little bit. We can see them reaching out to supporters and really for the first time saying we're not reaching our goals, help us get there. I think the latest they were at was 17 or 18 million this quarter, and they're trying to get 20. They had about 25 last quarter. So they've seen a slowdown. We have them really reaching out to supporters in a way that they generally don't. They're also really talking a lot about how Warren calls people who donate to her. She doesn't sell call time to wealthy donors, but calls small donors, calls anyone by chance who might donate to her. And then the other thing that we see her sort of shifting as she's lost some momentum is the style for town halls. probably pretty likely that here today in Iowa, she will take about a dozen questions. Until recently, she would give her stump speech, take 3 questions. Lately, she's really been trying to interact with voters in an attempt to sort of regain some momentum she had earlier this year.
Well, Jack, Pete Buttigieg is doing very well in Iowa. What is he doing to maintain that surge, and is he embracing the top-tier status?
Yeah, it's really interesting. He recently said yesterday that when he told reporters basically, like, it's time to consolidate support here in Iowa with 5 weeks until the caucuses. But he did caution and say, look, we're still going to have the mentality of an underdog campaign. We can't get too caught up in the poll numbers here in Iowa. And it just to show how much he cares about Iowa, recently after the California debate in December, he went to Iowa, immediately went to Nevada, went to Iowa right before the Christmas break, and then after the Christmas break is now back here in Iowa. And just for context, he really scaled up his operation here in Iowa in the third quarter. After a really strong second quarter of fundraising, he scaled his operation up here. He now has more than 100 staff members on the ground. And the campaign has really focused on relational organizing, really building out the networks through families and friends, and then building out the networks that way instead of the traditional cold calls. So it's important to note that, and also just the fact that he's back here in Iowa after the holiday break, right before New Year's, and squeezing a trip in here shows a lot of his focus is here in Iowa. And just having that mentality of an underdog campaign and not really getting caught up in the polls is something to note out as well.
Well, in New Hampshire on Saturday, Senator Bernie Sanders was asked twice if his signature policies would force people to lose their jobs. Here's what he said to a girl who asked the senator if her father, who works in the energy sector, would lose his job if the Green New Deal was implemented.
I am strongly pro-worker. That's my background, it's my family. I am strongly pro-union. We have to, as quickly as humanly possible, move away from fossil fuel. Now, built into the Green New Deal proposal that I have introduced is the most generous and comprehensive program to protect workers who will lose their jobs in this transition. Those workers working on oil rigs or in the oil industry are not my enemies. They are simply trying to feed their families, and I got that. So what we have proposed in there is that a very expensive proposal, it is unprecedented, is to say that we will guarantee income to those workers for 5 years, job training, education, health care. We will do everything we can to make them whole as they find new sources of employment.
So, Nicole, fascinating to hear Senator Sanders field that question. Are those kinds of difficult questions a concern for the Sanders campaign?
Well, absolutely. Certainly, as our campaign reporter, Carrie Corte, reported just yesterday, Bernie Sanders received 2 of those types of questions. And quietly, members of builders' unions will tell me here that they are concerned about a loss of jobs. Of course, you heard Senator Bernie Sanders proposing to guarantee income for those workers for 5 years, job training, education, health care. Questions I get is, what happens after those 5 years? That being said, according to our CBS News Battleground Tracker polls dating back from the summer, climate change here in New Hampshire is consistently the #2 issue of importance behind health care. So voters are constantly telling me they want to hear more, not less, about how we're going to get to net zero carbon emissions. And certainly Senator Bernie Sanders has been very strong on putting climate change front and center of many of his campaign stump speeches. Now, that being said, should Senator Bernie Sanders become the nominee, he might have to deal with more of a moderate voting group of voters who might be more concerned. Certainly, there are a number of Democratic likely voters who tell me they're concerned that the senator has moved too far to the left in his climate policy, but those folks might decide to vote for someone else in the Democratic primary to begin with.
All right, we will be watching it all closely. Nicole Sganga, Zach Hudak, and Jack Turman, our intrepid CBS News campaign reporters. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.